Hello and welcome to a discussion about immigration. This is the first exposure we have to immigration, and we're going to talk through an immigration law timeline because even though immigration is a very controversial topic in this day and age in our country, it stems from years and years of controversy surrounding the idea of immigration and people coming to our country, which is actually really funny in the ironic sense because unless you're American Indian, all of us were immigrants to this country. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll walk you through some of the different laws that were passed for sometimes seemingly frivolous reasons, but for, the protection, or so they thought, of the people of our country. So we begin in 1882, where we passed something that was called the Exclusion Act. And what this did was it barred, quote, idiots, lunatics, persons likely to become public charges from coming to the United States. So what does that mean? Well, if you were coming to the United States and you were coming on time because the bell rang, you were coming from Europe, you would stop and end up in Ellis Island in New York City. And what would happen is as you disembarked from the boat, you would be looked over to see if you were healthful and ready for acceptance into the United States. So basically what happened is the people who were looking at people coming to the new country, to the United States, would look to see if you were, quote unquote, an idiot. So how do we know someone's an idiot? Well, we take a look at them and go, yeah, you're an idiot, so you can't come to this country. I mean, the whole process was just silly. A person likely to become a public charge is someone who is going to screw around, and it's going to result in the government having to step in and either pay for that person, or we'll have to put them in jail, or they'll become a burden to society. So the Exclusion Act was to exclude idiots, lunatics, and people likely to become public charges. Also in 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act that said no more Chinese immigrants could come, and we kept that in place until after World War II. So yeah, that was the first kind of Asian exclusion, was the Chinese, and basically the reason was because they were given a lot of jobs, and people wanted white, quote-unquote, Americans to have jobs and not these Chinese immigrants. In 1907, we switch a little bit, and we passed the Gentleman's Agreement. And what is a gentleman? Early on, John Smith came over with a bunch of gentlemen on his ship, and it basically was people that, didn't do anything because they were too high and mighty to do anything. A gentleman is someone who has class and manners and is high society. So we passed the Gentleman's Agreement to exclude Japanese people. Really? How is that being a gentleman? Also, it excluded people with physical or mental defects or tuberculosis and unaccompanied children. So the Gentleman's Agreement excluded people who were handicapped and the Japanese. Okay, that makes total sense. We basically were looking for a reason to keep out, quite honestly at this time, could your average white person at Ellis Island tell the difference between a Chinese person and a Japanese person? No. So that's why we brought this in. Again, people that are different than us make white people nervous. So we didn't want to do anything that would jeopardize any more people who we saw as a threat into coming into our country. Someone's standing outside my door. So we weren't very gentlemanly with the Japanese and anyone who had any sort of disability. In thinking about it too, how do you know looking at someone that they have a mental defect? I could look around the room and think, 10% of the kids have a mental defect, but that's just me being snarky, right? I mean, you can't just look at someone and know. So it really gave a lot of power to the people who were at Ellis Island and admitting people to say, hey, you have a mental defect, so you have to go back. 1917, we have the Immigration Act, and now we're just going to exclude all Asians because we're tired of trying to tell the difference between them. You had to be able to read. No persons of psychopathic inferiority. We wouldn't allow people who were entering for immoral purposes, alcoholics, stowaways, or vagrants. So the Immigration Act really, in a nutshell, was trying to clean up society, if you would, like the other ones before, I guess. But we're excluding all Asians, and you had to be literate. So you had to be able to read. But here's the problem. Many people who come over to our country can read in their native language. They just can't read in English. So to say that you're not literate is actually not fair. Okay? No persons of psychopathic inferiority, really? I mean, who is that addressing? Again, it's up to the judgment of the people at some place like Ellis Island to say, these are the people that we think have psychopathic inferiority. Now, the number of people who were turned away as a result of these things is minimal. However, it still was there as a qualification in the law that was passed in 1917. 1921, we have the Emergency Quota Act. So a quota is going to limit the number of immigrants to 3% of the total number of persons of their nationality admitted in 1910. And if you back it up and think about the people that were coming to the United States in the mid-1800s, we have a lot of Germans and a lot of Irish coming to the United States. So these were the people, you know, we had the British initially that settled here, and then we have the Germans and the Irish coming in. And it got to the point where there were signs hanging that said no Irish or dogs allowed, you know, things of that nature. And so every group that has come over has gone through their period of persecution as a result of being the new people on the block. So before 1910, we had moved into the Germans, again, the Irish, and then we moved into more of the South Europe or Eastern European people that are coming over. So in the 1900s, we have a lot of Italians coming over, Eastern Europeans, and then we get nervous because the Germans and the Irish kind of looked like the people who were here before, but now everybody's got dark hair, and we're getting, you know, a little bit scared because their language isn't like ours. You know, the Irish we can at least kind of understand, you know, so we're going through different transitions in who's accepted and who's not accepted in terms of our country's development. So, yeah, 1924, we have another quota act that's passed. It reduces the quota to 2% of the nationality from 1890 or earlier. So now we're saying, whoa, we don't want any more of those Southern or Eastern Europeans to come in. Prior to 1890, it was mostly the Germans and the Irish. So the cap was at 2% of the Irish that were admitted in 1890 or, you know, things like that. 1953, we have the Refugee Relief Act. So we're starting to bring over Europeans who are suffering under the regimes of communism. So if you are, you know, an Eastern European country or someone who suffers as a result of communism, you now can be admitted as a refugee in 1953. 1963, we get rid of the national origin system. So we get rid of this whole quota thing where you have to match the number of people from Ireland or Germany that are coming over, and it opens it up to more third world countries. So more people are going to be allowed from the Western Hemisphere. It's going to give preferences to relatives of U.S. citizens and permanent resident aliens. Also, it's going to give preference to skills that we need in our country, so immigrants that have a skill set and refugees. And this is in it actually should say 1965. In 1978, we established yet another quota, and we set a worldwide quota. We set a cap at 290,000. So that was as many as could be admitted in one country. No specific country could have more than 20,000 immigrants coming in, and there was a preference given to people that had skills. So if you were an astrophysicist or something, you know, you'd be admitted before someone who didn't have that skill. So that was 1978. 1980, we have the Refugee Act, which is going to expand refugee status to more than just people who are escaping from communism. So if your life is at threat or if you are in imminent danger in your country, then you can be considered a refugee and you can come to the United States. 1986, we have Immigration Reform and the Control Act, IRCA, that legalizes aliens who have been in the United States since 1982. So if you've been here for 4 years, you will be a legal alien. And it also is going to penalize corporations or people who hire illegal immigrants. So now we're starting to try and crack down a little bit on illegal immigration, which certainly is something that we still struggle with. And then in 1990, we had some comprehensive legislation that was passed that moved our overall cap to 675,000. So in 1995, 675,000 people were admitted, and that was the status quo for a while. There were, however, separate pathways that you could take for a family-sponsored immigrant or an employment-based immigrant or people from countries that aren't as well represented in our country. So if you're from, Djibouti, maybe you had a better chance of coming over because there weren't as many people here from Djibouti yet. So all in all, and of course, immigration law today is kind of a jumble of a number of different things. Many would argue that they aren't working the way that they should be. There also always is talk kind of in the system for how to bring about new change and new growth for the immigration system, but I don't know that we've nailed it down yet. But historically speaking, each group has gone through their kind of period of subjugation and discrimination as they've come to the United States. So, you could argue that now the groups being penalized or being persecuted would probably be maybe Hispanic Americans or Hispanic immigrants or Muslim immigrants, from Arab nations. Those would be kind of the target groups right now. And eventually, white Americans will get used to having them here, and then we'll move on and persecute another group, which is not the best way of going about living in society, but it's historically what our country has done. So, immigration law, we'll be talking a little bit more about immigration in class tomorrow. Have a good night.